For 47 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran has survived everything Washington could throw at it. Sanctions embargoes asset freezes the snapback mechanism, secondary penalties on third-party banks. Tehran absorbed every blow and kept exporting oil, kept funding its proxies, kept building its network of influence across the Middle East. The regime even had a slogan for it, the resistance economy. But in the spring of 2026, something happened that 4 decades of American pressure could not achieve. Two of Iran's closest economic partners, the United Arab Emirates and India, simultaneously walked out the door. They didn't issue statements of condemnation. They didn't join Western sanctions. They simply left. And now the Iranian regime is bleeding to death from a wound it never saw coming. What if we told you that the U.S. naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is not even the deadliest weapon being used against Tehran right now? The real knife is being twisted by the friends Iran trusted most. We'll get to that shocking detail in a moment. But first, we need to look at how Tehran arrived at this catastrophic moment of total isolation. To understand the magnitude of what just happened, we need to step back to February 28, 2026. That was the day the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes across Iran, decapitating the regime's senior leadership and beginning what is now called the 2026 Iran War. Within hours, Iran's response was as predictable as it was self-destructive. Tehran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow 33-kilometer waterway through which roughly 25% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of its liquefied natural gas flows every single day. The regime believed it was playing its ultimate trump card. Block the strait choked the global economy, forced Washington to back down. It didn't work. Instead, on April 13, 2026 at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States Navy imposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports under the direct command of CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper. Within 5 days, U.S. forces had intercepted 23 vessels. By early May, that number had climbed past 49 commercial ships forced to turn back. President Donald Trump declared on Truth Social that the blockade was costing Iran $500 million every single day. The U.S. Department of Defense calculated that by May 1st, Tehran had already lost $4.8 billion in oil revenue. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went further, posting that Kharg Island, where 90% of Iran's crude exports are loaded, would soon be completely full, forcing what he called the fragile Iranian oil wells to be shut in. This was already a catastrophe for the regime, but the real betrayal had not yet been delivered. We'll return to the blockade shortly. First, you need to understand the strategic earthquake that detonated in Abu Dhabi on April 28th. So, why is the United Arab Emirates' decision to abandon OPEC the single most devastating blow Iran has suffered in decades? Because it represents the end of Arab energy solidarity. For 59 years, the UAE was a founding pillar of OPEC. Founded in 1960, the cartel existed precisely to coordinate production cuts that protected weaker members like Iran during downturns. When Iranian exports collapsed under sanctions, OPEC quotas kept global prices high enough for Tehran to survive on whatever oil it could smuggle out. That mechanism is now gone. On April 28, 2026, the Emirati Ministry of Energy announced that the UAE would formally exit OPEC effective May 1st. The decision lifted every production ceiling Abu Dhabi had been bound by. And here is where the math becomes brutal for Tehran. Before the war, the UAE was producing around 3.4 million barrels per day under its OPEC quota, even though its sustainable capacity was nearly 4.85 million barrels per day. The quota system had been costing Abu Dhabi between $50 and $70 billion per year in lost revenue. Now those constraints are gone, and the UAE has invested $150 billion to push capacity to 5 million barrels per day by 2027. But the truly devastating part isn't the volume, it's the route. The UAE possesses the only major Gulf pipeline that completely bypasses the Strait of Hormuz. The Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, also called ADCOP, is a 380-kilometer overland artery running from the Habshan oil fields in Abu Dhabi, directly to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. It has a capacity of approximately 2 million barrels per day. While Iranian oil is trapped behind a U.S. naval blockade and Iran's own self-imposed strait closure, Emirati crude is flowing freely to global markets through a pipeline that doesn't touch Hormuz at all. Here is the cost equation that should terrify Tehran. Iran is losing $500 million per day to the blockade, while the UAE just unlocked an annual revenue ceiling worth roughly $60 billion. That's a daily swing of more than $660 million in favor of Abu Dhabi at Tehran's direct expense. Every additional barrel the UAE pushes through Fujairah captures a piece of the market share Iran can no longer serve. Indian refineries that used to buy discounted Iranian crude now have a new supplier on the same coastline. Chinese teapot refineries that built their entire business model around shadow shipments of Iranian oil are quietly switching their long-term contracts to Emirati grades. The UAE has effectively become Iran's replacement supplier to the world with one critical advantage. UAE oil is legal, Iran's is contraband, and the regime in Tehran is paying for the privilege of being replaced. But here's the most crucial point. Sanctions can be evaded. A physical blockade cannot. For 47 years, Iran built an entire industry of evasion. Shell companies in Hong Kong, Liberian flags of convenient ship-to-ship transfers in the Gulf of Oman, AIS transponders switched off for weeks at a time. Al Jazeera's investigative unit tracked 202 voyages by 185 vessels through the strait between March 1st and April 15th, many of them deliberately operating outside the rules. By April 20th, Lloyd's List had documented at least 26 ships bypassing the U.S. blockade line in both directions. The Shadow Fleet was supposed to be Iran's insurance against any economic siege. It hasn't worked, because the U.S. Navy is not enforcing a paper restriction. It is enforcing a physical perimeter. CENTCOM destroyers and marine expeditionary units are physically boarding suspect vessels, including the cargo ship MV Blue Star 3 on April 28th. Aircraft carrier satellite tracking and over-the-horizon radar arrays are watching every transit in real time. When the U.S. Navy intercepted 23 vessels in 5 days, those weren't legal disputes. Those were marine boarding operations. Iran's Ghost Fleet tactics have run headfirst into a steel wall of American sea power. You can falsify a flag. You cannot falsify a marine boarding party. But why would the UAE do this now? Because Abu Dhabi has chosen sides decisively and permanently. The UAE's exit from OPEC is part of a broader strategic realignment that links it directly to Washington, Tel Aviv, and New Delhi. Israeli Iron Dome batteries have been deployed on Emirati soil for the first time in history to defend against Iranian retaliation. Reports indicate the U.S. Treasury is providing the UAE with a dollar swap line as financial reinsurance. And the proposed India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, the IMEC, explicitly bypasses both Iran and the broader Arab League. Abu Dhabi is no longer a Gulf neutral. It is a member of the American-Israeli axis. So, while Iran's tankers sit anchored at Kharg Island with nowhere to go, the UAE is shipping 1.7 million barrels a day out of Fujairah, untouched by Hormuz, untouched by the blockade, untouched by Iranian harassment. Tehran is being economically smothered, while watching its closest Arab neighbor get richer by replacing it. And that's only the first half of the betrayal. The second blow came from a country Iran considered its most important non-Arab partner, India. For nearly 2 decades, India invested heavily in the Iranian port of Chabahar on the Gulf of Oman. New Delhi paid roughly $120 million to develop the Shahid Beheshti terminal, signed a 10-year operating agreement in 2024, and made Chabahar the centerpiece of its international north-south transport corridor, a 7,200-kilometer trade route designed to connect India to Central Asia, Russia, and Europe by bypassing Pakistan entirely. For Tehran, Chabahar was the strategic insurance policy. If Hormuz ever closed, Chabahar sat outside the strait and could keep Iranian trade flowing. That insurance policy just expired. On April 26, 2026, the U.S. sanctions waiver that had allowed India to operate at Chabahar lapsed. President Trump had warned in January that any country doing business with Iran would face an additional 25% tariff on all U.S. trade. India, already negotiating under the weight of a 50% tariff regime, made the only choice it could. New Delhi quietly transferred its operational stake at Chabahar to an Iranian entity with a face-saving clause that the rights would return once sanctions were lifted. In the language of diplomacy, this is called a tactical recalibration. In reality, India has walked out. The strategic damage to Iran is staggering. Chabahar was supposed to be the regime's escape valve, the lifeline that kept goods flowing even when the rest of the country was under siege. Now it is just another sanctioned Iranian port with no foreign operator, no international shipping, and no political cover. The Indian government, which has roughly 10 million of its citizens working in the Gulf states sending remittances home, was never going to choose Tehran over Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. It just took the war to make that obvious. Now let me show you what this double abandonment actually means on the ground at Kharg Island. According to satellite analysis from the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, between April 13th and April 21st, Iranian crude stocks at Kharg rose by more than 6 million barrels. From April 17th to 21st, stocks were rising at 1.7 million barrels per day, which is consistent with a near-total cessation of exports. Storage utilization passed 74% of design capacity by April 20th. JP Morgan estimates Iran has between 20 and 26 days of total capacity remaining before forced shutdowns become unavoidable. Bloomberg analysts and KPLR are even more aggressive, putting the timeline at 12 to 22 days. In a sign of pure desperation, Iran has reactivated the MT Nasha, a 30-year-old very large crude carrier that had been sitting derelict for years, repurposing it as floating storage. The vessel adds maybe 2 million barrels of capacity. Analysts at Tanker Trackers describe this as not much. Besant put it more bluntly on Twitter. In a matter of days, Kharg Island storage will be full and the fragile Iranian oil wells will be shut in. If the wells are forced to shut down, the consequences are catastrophic and may be permanent. Sudden well closures cause irreversible geological damage, destroying production capacity that took decades and billions of dollars to develop. Iran is not simply losing revenue. It is risking the long-term destruction of the very oil fields that fund the entire state. So how is the rest of the world reacting to all of this? The picture tells you everything about where the global balance has shifted. Saudi Arabia is now stranded between a hostile Iran and a defecting UAE. With Abu Dhabi flooding the market and shattering OPEC discipline, prices could fall below the threshold. Saudi Arabia needs to fund its Vision 2030 economic transformation. Riyadh entered 2026 already strained, and Iraq is in even worse shape with a projected $259 million budget deficit. The Gulf Cooperation Council is fracturing in real time. The European Union, the United Kingdom, and Australia have all officially declined to join the U.S. blockade, instead promoting an alternative multinational mission. Spanish Defense Minister Margarita Robles publicly stated that the blockade makes no sense. But this diplomatic pushback is symbolic. None of these countries are buying Iranian oil. None of them are saving Tehran. Russia has voiced support for Iran, but has done nothing operationally meaningful. Moscow has its own war to fund and its own oil exports to protect. China, which historically purchased the largest share of Iranian crude through its dark fleet operations, has gone silent. 2 Chinese vessels were even blocked by Iran from entering Hormuz on March 27th. Beijing is calculating whether the regime in Tehran is worth the secondary sanctions risk. The answer increasingly appears to be no. The era in which Iran could count on a global cushion of partner sympathizers and economic enablers has ended. The regime now stands alone in a way it has not since 1979. But the deepest wound from this double betrayal isn't economic. It's the collapse of Tehran's regional power projection. For 4 decades, Iran's oil revenue funded the so-called Axis of Resistance, the sprawling network of proxy militias that gave the regime strategic depth from Beirut to Sana'a. Hezbollah received hundreds of millions of dollars per year. The Houthis got drones, missiles, and cash. Iraqi militias like Kataib Hezbollah received funding, training, and political cover. When the oil money stops, this network does not pause. It bleeds. Hezbollah was already a shell of its former self after Israel's devastating 2024 campaign that killed Hassan Nasrallah and decimated the group's command structure. By March 2026, Hezbollah's ill-fated intervention against Israel had effectively ended its existence as a regional actor. The Lebanese government has now formally banned the group's military activities. The Houthis, despite Abdul Malik al-Houthis' January 2026 statements of support for Tehran, have been so weakened by U.S. Operations Poseidon, Archer, and Rough Rider that any major action against American targets risks the group's outright collapse. Iraqi militias have stayed quiet. The deafening silence of Iran's proxies during this war reveals the truth. The network Tehran spent 40 years building has unraveled in weeks. Think about what this actually means. The Iranian regime spent 40 years and tens of billions of dollars building a regional security architecture explicitly designed to deter exactly this scenario. Hezbollah's rocket arsenal in Lebanon was supposed to make any direct attack on Iran politically impossible. The Houthis' missiles in Yemen were supposed to threaten Saudi and Emirati oil infrastructure if the Gulf states sided with Washington. The Iraqi militias were supposed to make U.S. bases in the region untenable. None of these deterrents activated when Iran needed them. Not when Khamenei was assassinated, not when the Strait was militarized, not when the blockade went live. The most sophisticated proxy network in modern history simply did not function the moment the test arrived. And the betrayal is not happening only at the borders. It is happening inside Iran itself. Between December 2025 and January 2026, Iran experienced the largest wave of protests since the 1979 revolution, with demonstrations in over 200 towns and cities across all 31 provinces. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard's response was a massacre. Local health officials, the human rights activists' news agency, The Guardian, and Iran International all documented somewhere between 7,000 and 36,500 protester deaths during just January 8th to 9th. Internet was shut down nationwide for 53 consecutive days, the longest such blackout ever recorded in any country. The Iranian communications minister Sattar Hashemi himself admitted the shutdown was costing the economy $35.7 million per day. This is the regime that is now asking the same population to live by candlelight to save oil revenue. President Pezeshkian, who was elected in 2024 on promises of reform, was forced to publicly apologize in February for the massacres. He has overseen rolling blackouts so severe that in some Tehran neighborhoods, power was out 32% of the time. He even floated the idea of relocating the capital because Tehran's water supply was failing. And here is the moment that captures it all. On a state television broadcast in late April, President Masoud Pezeshkian, looking exhausted and visibly diminished, addressed the Iranian people. He did not talk about resistance. He did not threaten Washington. Instead, he begged his own citizens to turn off their lights. Quote, "Instead of turning on 10 lights at home, turn on 2 lights. What is wrong with that?" End quote. This is the leader of a country with the world's second-largest natural gas reserves and the third-largest oil exporter in OPEC asking his people to save electricity by 80%. The mythology of the resistance economy has been replaced by the reality of the begging economy. So, what does the bigger picture look like now? Let's step back. A regime that survived 47 years of Western sanctions brought to its knees in 6 weeks. An OPEC framework that protected Tehran for decades shattered by a single Emirati signature. A strategic port in Chabahar that was supposed to be the escape valve abandoned by the partner who built it. A network of proxy militias that projected Iranian power from Beirut to Sana'a going silent. An oil industry on the verge of permanent geological damage. A president on television asking citizens to live by candlelight. Let's go back to the beginning. We told you that 2 of Iran's closest economic partners simply walked out the door. We told you that what 4 decades of American pressure could not achieve, this double betrayal accomplished in a matter of weeks. And now you understand why. Sanctions can be evaded with shell companies, ghost tankers, and disabled transponders. But you cannot evade the fact that your closest neighbor has built a pipeline that bypasses you, joined the American axis, and is now selling the oil you cannot ship. You cannot evade the fact that your most important non-Arab partner has chosen Washington over Tehran. The Islamic Republic was never defeated by the West. It was abandoned by its own neighborhood. So, what are your thoughts on this historic collapse? Do you believe the Iranian regime can survive another 6 weeks of this dual blockade and double betrayal? Will the next domino to fall be Hezbollah's final dissolution, the Houthis' organizational collapse, or a regime-ending wave of unrest inside Iran itself, or is the era of the Islamic Republic itself coming to its long-delayed end? We look forward to your comments below. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is happening in the Middle East right now, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dive geopolitical breakdowns. Thank you for choosing us and watching until the end.